We're all in this together. You're watching Social Distance Learning by ISBA. Get the kids together. Learn something new. Ask a few questions and engage.
To you all. My name is Sadaf and this is ISBA's very first episode of Social Distance Learning. It's our attempt to stay engaged with the community while we are all doing our part, keeping ourselves and our loved ones healthy during this time. Today's episode will be a basic introduction on the art of Islam with a little bit more emphasis on Islamic geometric art. It is geared towards everyone. Some of the concept might be a little bit harder to understand for the very, very young, but I still hope that you can gather everyone around you, around your viewing device, so everyone can benefit from this talk and lecture. Before we go ahead, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have worked with ISBA on several projects over the years, and currently I'm serving on the board of ISBA. I'm an artist by trade, and I have a special interest in Islamic art. I've studied under several experts, and currently I'm working on a certification to teach Islamic geometric art. Last year, I was honored enough to be able to teach at the Phoenix Art Museum several sessions on Islamic art. In general, I just love teaching about Islamic art. It's a beautiful art form. So a little bit about today's talk, or about today's episode, actually. It's going to be a lecture or a talk format. But if you join me on April 9th, Thursday, April 9th, for the next episode that I appear on, I will be walking you through a step-by-step tutorial on how to create your very own Islamic geometric pattern. So let's get started. First slide, please. Thank you. So first things first, let's talk about what exactly is Islamic art. Islamic art is basically any art that has been traditionally created in, it encompasses actually all of the visual arts that have been created within the Islamic world. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious art, although a lot of times it is, but it just could be any art that has been created in the Islamic world or created in that tradition, even outside of the Islamic world. So basically, in traditional Islam, drawing pictures or faces or figures was prohibited. So over the centuries since the dawn of Islam, artists had to come up with a way to depict their thoughts and decorate buildings and basically create artworks of all kinds without the use of those pictures and faces and figures and forms. So if you could go to the next slide, please. There are three basic categories of Islamic art, generally, traditionally. If you can see on the slide, the first one is calligraphy, which encompasses anything that is a written art form. It can be very exact scripts. I don't know if you could see this, for example, very exact scripts that follow rules and exact traditions, or it could be just freehand done by an artist. The second one is geometric art, which you can see in the middle picture right there. It basically is any art that has been created using geometry. And the last one is arabesque. Arabesque art forms are basically art forms that encompass things like floral designs, vegetal designs, and basically any kind of, a lot of times you see this kind of work on pottery. You see that in the picture right there. It's an example of an Islamic pottery from Turkey. So that's the floral art form. It is very beautiful, and it is perhaps the most common one that you see. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the reason I picked geometric art as a focus for today's episode is because, first and foremost, you don't need any kind of artistic ability to be able to create this art form. Basically, if you are able to follow directions step by step, a step-by-step tutorial, you can create this art form. You don't need a freehand drawing ability to be able to do that. So it is very accessible for everyone. And also, even though the name suggests geometry, you don't actually need any mathematical knowledge to be able to create this art form. Some mathematical knowledge might be useful in the more complex creations, but it is still not 100% necessary. Also, using very simple steps, you can actually make a very complex design. So it doesn't have to be a very simple design resulting from simple steps, but it can actually turn into a very complex design, a very beautiful design, just by following simple steps. And there are also limitless variations. As I will show you in the next few minutes, you can actually create many, many different variations of the same design, and it can be just infinitely, there can be infinite possibilities in that. So if you could go to the next slide. The next thing I would like to talk about is that within geometric art, there are three basic principles of Islamic geometric art. And then, if you remember these principles, they will help you in not only creating these designs, but also it'll help you in identifying these kind of patterns when you see pictures, or in, God willing, good times, you can travel and see these things yourself. So the very first principle of Islamic geometric art is that almost all of Islamic geometric art falls under three major categories or families of designs. It's not always the case. There are rare patterns that do not follow this mold. However, most of them do follow this rule. Majority of designs are either four-fold designs, five-fold designs, or six-fold designs. I will elaborate more on that in a few minutes, but basically it has to do with how the pattern has been created, and I will elaborate more on that. If you could go to the next slide. The second principle of Islamic geometric art is that it takes very simple tools to create it. There's no special tools or paints or anything else that's needed to create a very basic design. All you need is paper, pencil, ruler, and a compass. Even eraser and a marker are optional. Those are useful in emphasizing certain lines and erasing the construction lines. Again, I will emphasize on that later. It's better to show you that in process. But in general, it's very easy to create these designs using very simple tools. Next slide, please. The third principle of Islamic geometric art is that for every pattern and a rosette that you see, there is a visible layer, obviously the one that you see, and there's also a hidden or an invisible layer. Once you start learning more about geometric art, you will be able to recognize this hidden layer within each of the patterns. And some of it is sometimes a little bit harder to see, but with practice, you can see that. So here, if you see on the left-hand side, I have a picture of a geometric pattern that has been put together in a very simple square grid. The pattern's been placed in simply just squares right next to each other. That's an example of the very first grid that you see, the squares in the green color over there. Next to it is another example of a grid that's triangles. And below that is a hexagonal grid, and next to it is one that is comprised of pentagons. You see all sorts of examples of grids, and sometimes the grids don't work exactly symmetrically like I've shown over here. Sometimes patterns are kind of mixed and matched together. But in general, the thing to remember is that there's a visible layer and an invisible layer in every Islamic geometric art pattern. Next slide, please. I think it would be useful to show you some real-life examples, and that will help you understand what I meant when I said that the first principle is that majority of the designs fall under a 4-fold, 5-fold, or a 6-fold design. If you could see on the left, the very first picture on the left, I have actually marked out the number of petals on that rosette, or the star shape in the very middle. There's 16 of those petals. Now, counting the petals is the easiest way to determine which family the pattern falls under. So because it's a 16-star rosette, 16 happens to be a multiple of 4, therefore it falls under the 4-fold category, the 4-fold family. So basically, while constructing these patterns, if I were to construct a pattern that is 4-fold, I would first need to start by dividing a circle into 4 equal parts. Again, I will walk you through that in the next few minutes. But in the meantime, if you look at the middle picture, it's a very good example of how different folds and different kinds of patterns and different kinds of star shapes are mixed together to create complex patterns within Islamic art. For the sake of simplicity, and because this is an intro sort of lesson, we're not going to talk about too much about how to combine different patterns together. There's sometimes a little bit more math involved in that. However, this is a good real life example of that. There is a 12-sided star, and there is an 8-sided star in that middle pattern. So the 8-sided star is obviously an example of a 4-fold design, whereas the 12-sided star, it gets a little complicated. In most basic introductory books and information about Islamic geometric art, this would be categorized as a 6-fold design because 12 happens to be a multiple of 6. But 12 can also be a multiple of 3 and 4. So there are different ways to construct a 12-sided star or rosette. The third picture you see on the right happens to be one of those more rare occasions when you see a pattern that has okay. All right. All right. Sorry about that. We were having some technical difficulties. So picking up where we left off, if you see in this picture, again, these are examples of different rosettes put together. The ones on the right are good examples of 6-fold patterns because if you look at them, they each have 6 petals in their rosette or the star design. The one on the left, again, has one of those rare patterns. The one on the top actually has 9 petals instead of the usual 4-fold, 5-fold, or a 6-fold design that you see. Next slide, please. Great. This is also another example, again, of, I believe, a fourfold pattern in the middle because it has 16 petals. And you can see, you can count up the petals, and hopefully you're able to understand which categories they fall into. The one on the left, we haven't seen another picture so far of a fivefold design. But as you can see, that one has 10 petals, 10 being a multiple of 5. That is one of the examples of a fivefold design. Okay, now let's talk about how to construct these patterns. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of Islamic geometric art actually starts out with a circle. Now, there is 2 schools of thought as to why that is. One school of thought is that basically a circle is just a circle, it's just a shape, it's an easy way to start creating patterns. There's also another school of thought that says that the circle is representative of, or a symbol of, all of God's creation and everything in the universe, basically. So it's a good starting place for any kind of art that's related to Islam, and it might be, a good, blessed way to start things like that. Either way, Islamic art starts out with a circle. Now, after that, the very first decision an artist needs to make is how many parts to divide that circle into. As we talked about, fourfold, fivefold, and sixfold designs, this is where the artist needs to determine which kind of pattern it'll be. If you start out by dividing the circle into 4 equal parts, that will end up being a fourfold pattern. If you end up dividing the circle into 5 equal parts, it'll be a fivefold design. And if it's 6 equal parts, it'll be a sixfold design. Again, there are other occasions when you might be dividing the circle into 7 equal parts, to create more, or 11 equal parts to create 7-fold or 11-fold designs. Those are more rare. And there are very, very rare occasions in which all of these sections are not equal. Some sections being a little bigger than the others. But for, again, sake of simplicity and an introductory episode, this is all you need to know, is the majority of these times you're going to either divide the circle into 4 equal parts, 5 equal parts, or 6 equal parts. Next slide, please. So although in this episode, I'm not going to be showing you the step-by-step tutorial on how to create these patterns, sometimes it is still helpful to kind of understand the process behind it. It helps understand some of these new terminologies and words and concepts more clearly. So I thought it would be easiest to start with a 6-fold pattern. It also looks very nice. It's kind of, fun to draw. It's easy for a lot of beginners to work on. So again, if you see on the left side, we start out with a circle, and that circle is usually resting on a horizontal line. It's sitting right in the middle of it. So that's how pretty much all of the Islamic geometric art patterns start. Then on the right-hand side, what you see is 6 more circles that have been added to that original circle. Now, in the step-by-step tutorial, if we were to pick this pattern, I would be showing you exactly how to go from point A to B. But for this, again, sake of brevity, I just want to show you that, this is basically what it looks like once 6 more circles have been added. Next slide, please. Okay, so using that collection of circles that you saw that create kind of like a flower, we end up with a hexagon. And the second picture, the image that you see on the right side, using that hexagon, we have created construction lines. These construction lines are not the ending pattern, if you will. They are the lines that help you construct the ending pattern. So these construction lines are drawn using lines that are drawn from the intersections of 2 lines to the intersections of another line. And, basically that's what guides your whole pattern. Next slide, please. Using the same construction lines, the last image that you saw on the right side in the last slide is the same image that you see on the top left in this slide. The only difference is that in this image, some of the lines have been emphasized more than the others. This is where a marker comes in handy, marker, or color pencil, or whatever other color that can differentiate from the pencil that you're working with. Using that emphasis on certain lines, you can create a whole rosette or rose pattern or a star pattern within Islamic geometric art, which is what you see on the right-hand side, top right-hand side image. And bottom left-hand side image, what you see is the same pattern without the construction lines. This is where the eraser comes in handy, because you can erase those construction lines and you can end up with that pattern, that star at the bottom. Now, if you color it, that's what you end up with at the end, the bottom right-hand side image. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Using that ending rosette, as you will see in the next slide, right there, I have used that rosette and I have put it together in a hexagonal grid in order to create a whole wall of pattern. Now, this is a very simple example of how to put together a pattern. Again, in the real world examples that you saw in the pictures earlier, patterns are generally not this simple. Usually you will see a more complex pattern mixed in with another complex pattern. You'll see that in tiles, Zalige tiles from Morocco and other carvings and such. But generally, this is how a pattern works, and this is how you can create your own patterns. You make a small rosette or a star-shaped pattern, and then you repeat it, or you mix it in with other stars and patterns, and then you repeat that whole combination to create a whole wall of designs. What you see on the right is the same exact pattern. Both of these patterns that you see on your screen right now, both of these images are the exact same. They've just been colored differently. They have been, colored in a different way to emphasize different attributes. So they look completely different to the, at first glance, they look completely different. Next slide, please. Now, this is an example of that invisible layer. You will probably never see this kind of representation in the real world. However, this is a good way for me to show you that underlying is that there's a hexagonal grid hidden in that pattern, the wall of pattern, basically, in that design. Again, we can use that rosette in a different kind of grid as well, but for a hexagonal pattern, a hexagonal grid works the best, actually. So next slide, please. Since we are talking about six-fold patterns, next slide, please. I figured it would be useful to talk about another six-fold pattern, but in this case, instead of ending up with a six-sided rosette, this will be a 12-sided rosette. So in this case, again, initially you start out with dividing the circle into 6 equal parts, and then further into 6 more equal parts, resulting in a total of 12 equal size segments. What that gives you is, what you can draw from that actually is 2 hexagons. One is a static hexagon, which is what you see in the middle image, emphasized in the red. And the other one is a dynamic hexagon, which is shifted a little bit at an angle to it. So we end up with 2 hexagons. In the third image, you see more construction lines have been added, basically in the shape of triangles. Next slide, please. And using those construction lines and adding a few more parallel lines and such, we end up this web of triangles that you see on the left hand side. And using that web of design, a web of lines, I should say, web of construction lines, you can emphasize just a few of those construction lines to create that little rosette or image on the right-hand side. Now, what you see on the left, if you use that image on the left, but you emphasize a whole other group of lines, you can end up with a very completely different looking rosette. It doesn't always have to end up looking like the one on the right-hand side, but it's called a 12-sided rosette, again, because if you count up the number of kites or the petals on the side of it, they equal 12. So it's a 6-fold pattern, and it's a 12-sided rosette. Next slide, please. I also put this pattern together in a tile to show you what it would look like all together. And again, same thing, but with a different background and a different color, just to give you an idea. Next slide, please. Now, this is an example of a 4-fold design, which is most commonly represented by just an 8-sided rosette. This is the pattern basically that I taught at the Phoenix Art Museum, because it is one of the most common and basic patterns to learn as a person who's just starting to learn about Islamic geometric art, in my opinion. And it's also one of the easiest to create again. So because it's a 4-fold pattern, you start out by dividing the circle into 4 equal parts. And then since we're creating an 8-sided rosette, we further divide that circle. That's what you see, the construction lines you see on the left-hand side, that's what it is. And on the right, what you see is how you end up with an octagon. Again, in a step-by-step tutorial, there will be about at least 5 or 6 different steps that I've skipped over for this presentation. Next slide, please. Using the octagon from the last slide and the construction lines, plus new construction lines added onto it, such as parallel lines and such, we end up with this rosette or star-shaped pattern that's fitting inside the octagon. And erasing the construction lines and coloring that pattern in, it results in that pattern that you see on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. Now that same pattern again has been repeated for 3 more times actually, resulting in that collection of 4 different rosettes that you see. It's been colored in, and again on the right hand what you see is the underlying grid for that pattern. So if you were to create that pattern in a large scale, you would start out with sort of a grid like that. Next slide, please. Again, that same pattern has been repeated many times to create a whole wall of designs. And on the right hand, what you see is the underlying grid. Next slide, please. Here I'm going to briefly talk about this concept of weaving the design. Just like in a fabric where the threads are weaved, or in a basket where pieces have been weaved together, Islamic geometric designs, a lot of times you see the patterns have been weaved together. And you see that a lot of times, you see that sometimes in tile work too, but a lot of times this is apparent in places where the patterns have been carved onto a building or a wood or a door, for example. So basically, you take the same pattern or the rosette from the last few slides, the 8-sided rosette. And you can do that with any pattern, but in this example, I'm just showing the 8-sided rosette. The lines are doubled, basically, and then one of those construction lines is erased to end up with that pattern that you see at the very right-hand side, where you can see each of the arms of the rosette or each of the threads of the rosette overlapping and going under other arms. It kind of goes over, under. And I've colored that pattern at the bottom to show you that. And I've added some shadows and stuff to show you what it looks like. It actually looks like the whole design is weaved. Now, if you imagine a whole wall of such a design weaved together, it creates a very beautiful effect. So that is just touching lightly on the concept of weaving the design. Next slide, please. I'm going to just quickly show you an example of a 5-fold pattern. For this particular pattern, you start out with dividing the circle into 10 equal parts. And on the right side, again, after many, many steps, which have been skipped over for this episode, what you end up with is a 10-sided star. And you can see all these construction lines, all these triangles in the middle of it. And like I said, we skipped over those steps, but basically it goes from just a circle divided into 10 equal parts to a star that's 10-sided and 10-pointed. Next slide, please. Now, using that star that we saw just now, you can emphasize lines to create, again, many different patterns. These are examples of 2 different patterns that have been created using that same 10-pointed star. On the left, the pattern that you see has a more open star shape in the middle. The star shape, again, like I said, is kind of open, but on the right hand, what you see is the same star shape, but it has been divided up into more kite shapes or petal shapes. So it is the interior star is a little bit more closed in. And again, these are made using the exact same construction lines. So that's an example of a 5-fold design. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this I'm going to talk about, this again is an example of a 4-fold design, but the reason I included this is because this is a great pattern to be used in classrooms. Now, I know a lot of teachers might be watching today, some students might be watching today. This is a great pattern to introduce in classrooms because the end result is just very beautiful. It's easy to create. I recently taught that to a group of 5th graders, and they really enjoyed this activity. If you are a teacher and you would like to know more about how to do such an activity, you can always email me. But I would suggest that to create a pattern like this, instead of having the children or your students use a compass, I would start out with a template, which is what you see on the very left-hand side in this image. A template basically allows all of the resulting patterns to be of the same size. So there's no use for a compass. There's no need for a compass, I should say. You just start out with that template. I passed out pieces of paper that had that particular image on the left-hand side printed onto it. And what you see in the middle image is how the students could be guided to create very simple construction lines, step by step. And the last image that you see is the resulting star shape that you end up with. If you go to the next slide, please. Using that star shape, if it's all put together, you can create a whole wall of pattern. And because it's within a square border, if the paper is cut out to that border, and all the patterns are put together in a very simple square grid, it can create a very beautiful effect. And I've kind of colored it on the right-hand side to show you how a student or child might color it and in all sorts of different ways. If you could go to the next slide, please. So these are pictures from the actual 5th grade class that I taught this pattern to. On the right-hand side is while the students were creating the pattern, some, as you can see, really went very creative and yes, colored in the circle itself and all of that. And the picture on the left is a smaller photograph, so I apologize for the quality. Basically, it was sent to me by the teacher. This is when all the pattern has been put together on the wall of their classroom. The children told me they really enjoyed this activity and they loved it. And because they started out with a template, everybody's pattern ended up being the same exact size, and it just worked out beautifully all together. So this is a great pattern to begin teaching students about Islamic geometric art. Next slide, please. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, there are some wonderful resources out there. There is a website called the School of Islamic Geometric Design. It's created by Eric Brogue. He was one of the experts in this field. And he has also written many books on this topic that are very, very useful. There's the book on Islamic geometric design itself. And there are other books such as this one. This is also by him. But anyway, I have listed a whole list of books and resources for you to look into. That website at the very top that you see actually has templates and many, many tutorials and, deeper introduction into this topic. So next slide, please. This pretty much concludes the very, very basic intro into Islamic geometric art. If you have any questions, this is just my basic info, like contact info. You can email me. Any comments that you might have, I'll try to go back and answer as many as I could. And other than that, I mean, I apologize if all of this information has been a little bit overwhelming. That was not the goal of this episode. I know there's a lot of new terminology and concepts to understand, and my goal was not to overwhelm you with all of that information. If my goal was that if you could take away one thing from this episode, it would be that if you were to see these patterns in real life, whether you're traveling, again, God willing, in good times, if you're able to travel to places like Morocco or see the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, or see the Taj Mahal, places like that, or if you see photographs of these places, I hope that when you look at them, you can understand that each inch of that detailed carving that you see has been planned meticulously. Somewhere, maybe centuries ago, some craftsmen sat there with very simple tools, created each one of these small patterns, and then repeated them thousands of times to create a whole wall of these carvings and tile work and such that you see. So that would be my takeaway. And I hope that you can learn to appreciate Islamic geometric art, knowing how much planning and thought goes behind each one of these small patterns. Now, I appreciate you guys all sticking around, and I hope that you can join me again on April 9th, Thursday, April 9th, so you can go through a step-by-step tutorial on how to create your own design. And in the meantime, I'm also going to add a list of tools that you would need. Again, like I mentioned, these are very simple tools. You might need pencil, ruler, compass, paper, eraser, marker, color pencils would be useful. I will list those. I think Joe mentioned they'd be listed in the description or some such place. If you are unable to use a compass, or you do not have one, or any children in your home are unable to use a compass, I will try to also add a template that you can print out and use to create the design. So that'll make the process even easier. So make sure to have that ready before April 9th. And please also tune in this Thursday, April 2nd, to see Dr. Uzma Jaffrey, when she will be talking about the 6 main beliefs in Islam. That will be the second episode of ISBA's Social Distance Learning. All of these episodes, by the way, are live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. However, if you are unable to watch them during the live stream, these will remain on Facebook and YouTube. I would like to thank Joe Balian for helping me with all the tech support and helping me with all the slides and stuff, all the background work that you see. Joe Balian is helping me with that. And I thank you all for watching. Assalamu alaikum, and peace to you all.